The cheque hit the marble floor of the Fairmont ballroom and skidded under a table draped in white linen, and the 23 people who'd watched my husband throw it at me went very, very quiet. The florals I'd spent 4 days designing surrounded us on every side. 12 tall arrangements of ranunculus and white garden roses that I'd delivered myself that afternoon and set in place by hand. And Curtis looked at me across one of them like I was a stranger who'd walked in off the street. "Take it and go," he said, loud enough. Loud enough that the string quartet in the corner stopped mid-phrase. "I'll deal with you later. Right now you're making a scene at the most important event of my career." I hadn't made a scene. I'd asked, quietly, why Lydia was wearing the necklace I'd reported missing from our house 3 weeks ago. That's where I should start, though. And because you can't understand how a 32-year-old woman ends up on her knees in a hotel ballroom retrieving a cheque her husband threw at her unless you understand how good everything looked from the outside. My name is Nina. 7 years ago, I married Curtis Harland at a small ceremony in his parents' backyard in Oakville, Ontario. The kind of neighborhood where the driveways are washed every spring and the Christmas lights go up the exact same week every year without anyone discussing it. Curtis was already a lawyer then, a junior associate at a Bay Street firm. Sharp and ambitious in the specific way that reads as confidence when you're 25 and reads as something else entirely once you're inside it. I was a florist. I'd trained at a design studio in Montreal, moved back to Toronto to work under someone I admired, and by the time I met Curtis, I was saving to open my own shop. Flowers had always been the one thing I understood completely. I knew how a David Austin rose behaved in cold storage, how to coax a tulip to open on schedule, how a single stem of eucalyptus could change the feeling of an entire room. Give me a bare table and a delivery of mixed blooms, and I'd make something that would make a bride close her eyes when she walked in. Curtis said once, early on, that watching me work was the thing that made him fall in love with me. He'd come to pick me up from a late setup and stood in the doorway of the venue for 10 minutes before he said anything, just watching. I kept that memory for years. The way you keep a dried flower pressed between pages, carefully, and long past the point where it still looks like the real thing. We didn't rush anything. I opened Bloom & Co. 2 years after the wedding, a small floral studio on Queen Street West with a cold room I'd paid extra for, and a workbench long enough to lay out a full wedding arch. The early years were tight. Curtis was working 80-hour weeks building toward partnership, and I was building client lists and word of mouth. We were tired and stretched and completely in it together, and most nights we'd fall asleep before 11 with our laptops still open and the phones still buzzing. The money changed when Curtis made partner. Not all at once. It never is. But he started billing at rates that surprised me when I caught the invoices left on the kitchen counter, and then we moved from our Leslieville condo into a detached house in Rosedale, and then there was a trip to Italy that felt like a movie, and then there was a new way Curtis talked in rooms full of people. A way of leading with the chin. A way of looking at his watch when someone else was still speaking. I noticed and told myself everyone changes when they get more responsibility. I told myself a lot of things. Here is where I have to talk about Lydia. Lydia Harland is Curtis's younger sister, 3 years behind him, and growing up in their family, she was the one nobody worried about because Curtis was already the one going places. Lydia drifted. A semester of business school, a certificate in legal administration, a stretch of contract work that never seemed to stick. She was quick and funny, and she had a talent for making you feel chosen when she paid attention to you. Which she did, selectively, strategically, in ways I only recognized much later. 2 years ago, she lost a position she'd held for 18 months and called Curtis in tears. He was in New York. He called me and asked if I thought she could handle paralegal work at the firm while she got back on her feet. I said yes. I said, she's family, and she just needs someone to believe in her. I sat with Curtis at our kitchen island and vouched for her. I helped her prep for the interview. I even bought her a blazer because the one she owned was the wrong weight for October. The firm hired her the following week. For about a month, I felt like I'd done the right thing. It started the way these things always start, so gradually that by the time you notice you've been walking in the wrong direction, you're already somewhere you don't recognize. The first incident. A corporate client of Curtis's had hired me to do florals for their quarterly board dinner. I had the brief in writing, white and ivory only, very classic, no scent. I delivered exactly that. The following morning, Curtis told me the client was unhappy. Apparently, I'd spoken to their office manager and said I'd use statement colors instead. Something modern, and she'd been surprised by the white arrangements when she arrived. I hadn't said that. I don't say statement colors. I have a consult intake form with check boxes that I use for every new client without exception. I showed Curtis the form. He looked at it and then looked at me with an expression I can only describe as patient concern. The kind a doctor uses when they're about to tell you something they've already decided. Nina, she has the email. What email? From your studio address, she forwarded it to me. I never sent that email. I know I never sent it because that client had come in person and we'd done the whole intake on paper. I still had the signed copy in my filing cabinet. But there was an email from my studio address in a thread I couldn't find in my own sent folder, and Lydia had been CC'd because she'd been the one who made the original introduction. She was sympathetic when I said it wasn't right. It might have been a misread, she said. Or maybe you sent it from your phone and it didn't save properly? That happens to me all the time. It's not a big deal, Nina. She said it's not a big deal in exactly the way that made it feel like a very big deal that I was making worse by not letting it go. Small things stacked up after that. A venue date I was sure I'd confirmed turned out to be a week earlier than I'd booked. A supplier invoice I'd filed under one name appeared under another. A contract turned up in my email drafts folder. Umsatrite, addressed to a florist I'd never contacted, for work that overlapped with an event already on my calendar. Curtis said I must have been reaching out to subcontractors and forgotten. I hadn't. I know my own drafts folder, the same way I know the layout of my cold room in the dark. Lydia started calling me every few days to check in. She always seemed to know, just slightly ahead of me when something was about to go wrong. She'd call and say, I heard there was a mix-up with the Dunmore event. Are you okay? And I'd say, how did you hear about that? And she'd say, Curtis mentioned it. He's just worried about you. I want to be honest with you because the only reason to tell this story is to tell it true. There was a period of maybe 8 months where I started believing them. I kept 3 copies of every intake form, photographed every in-person confirmation, backed up every sent email to a second account. Not because I thought I was wrong, but because I couldn't prove I was right, and I'd started to feel the ground tilting under me in a way I couldn't explain. I Googled memory problems in your early 30s. I asked my GP about stress and cognition. I started going to bed earlier and cutting out wine entirely, looking for the flaw in myself. The only place I never doubted myself was the studio. At Bloom & Co., my records were exact. My clients renewed every season. My staff trusted my memory for everything from supplier lead times to which bride had a sister with a peony allergy. My studio manager, Abby, a precise and sharp-eyed woman who'd been with me since year 2, used to say I could recite the cold room inventory blindfolded. Some nights I'd drive home from a 12-hour setup and sit in the car outside the Rosedale house and think, how is it that I'm completely competent inside the studio and completely unreliable everywhere else? It took me longer than I'd like to admit before I finally asked the obvious question. If the errors only appeared in contexts that involved Lydia and Curtis, maybe the problem wasn't me. The night before the gala, I went to Curtis' home office to drop off a folder the Fairmont's event coordinator had emailed me. Final guest count, room diagram. And I knocked, and he said, "Come in," and when I opened the door, he closed his laptop faster than was necessary. That was all. A flicker. But I was someone who'd been slowly trained to ignore flickers, so I set the folder down and said goodnight and went to bed. I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark and thought about the pattern. About Lydia, who always knew just before anything went wrong. About the email from my studio address that I never sent. About the fact that Curtis's most important client, Gala, was the following evening. A hospital foundation event I'd been hired to do the flowers for, and something felt wrong in a way I couldn't put a name to yet. The next evening was the Fairmont. I'd spent 4 days on those arrangements. 12 centerpieces, 2 statement pieces flanking the entrance, buttonholes for the presenting partners. I delivered everything myself, stayed to oversee the setup, and everything was exactly right. Curtis arrived with a group of partners at 7. He nodded at me across the room in a way that wasn't unkind, the nod you give a contractor you recognize, and I went back to adjusting the entrance display. Then Lydia walked in. She came in on the arm of one of the junior associates, laughing, and she was wearing a necklace I recognized immediately. It was a garnet drop necklace I'd bought in Montreal the year before I was married. A small antique piece with a chip in the gold clasp on the back. I knew that chip because I'd been meaning to have it repaired and kept forgetting. I'd noticed that it's missing some from my jewelry box 3 weeks earlier and mentioned it to Curtis, and he'd said I'd probably left it somewhere. She was wearing it. I crossed the room. I wasn't angry, or I was, but it was the cold kind, the kind that makes you very precise. I touched Lydia's elbow and I said quietly, "Where did you get that necklace?" What happened next was fast. She looked at Curtis. He looked at me. And then he stepped forward and said something I won't repeat in full, and he reached into his jacket and pulled out a check. Payment for the florals. And he threw it at me in front of 23 people. Partners, clients, spouses, a city councilor, the hospital foundation's executive director. Take it and go. Right now, you're making a scene at the most important event of my career. I looked at him. I looked at Lydia, who had the same small, settled expression she'd worn every single time I'd been made to feel unreliable in my own home, and I understood, in the specific way you understand something when all the pieces finally orient themselves, that the scene had been constructed. Not tonight. This had taken months. The emails, the contracts, the careful cultivation of a narrative about poor Nina, who was struggling, who was forgetful, who was a liability. He'd needed me to be the problem before tonight. He'd needed everyone in this room to already have a picture of me as someone who couldn't be taken seriously. I picked up the check from the floor. I said nothing. I walked out. I drove to the studio. It was the only place my body knew to go. I let myself in through the back, went directly to the cold room, 9 degrees, dark, smelling of water and refrigerated greenery, and I sat on an overturned crate and gave myself 15 minutes. Timed on my phone, the way you time a delicate process that can't be rushed but also cannot wait indefinitely. I didn't fall apart. I want to say I did, because that's what people expect, and there's something almost easier about the falling apart. But the truth is, I sat in the cold with my coat pulled around me, and I felt something clarify. Not rage, not grief, just clarity. The cold room had always been where I thought best. It was the one place in my life where nothing had ever been wrong with me. When the 15 minutes were done, I came out and sat at my workbench under the fluorescent light, and I started thinking like a florist instead of a wife. A florist's real job is inventory. You know what you have, what's missing, what's past saving. You don't panic when something goes sideways. You assess. So I assessed. I had the studio. I had client accounts and the income they generated, which Curtis had always described as modest because I'd never corrected him. My December corporate season alone cleared 6 figures. I had Abby, who was the only person I'd told pieces of the truth to, and I had something I hadn't recognized as an asset until right now. For 8 months, ever since Abby had sat across from me during our end-of-month review and said very carefully, "Nina, I think someone is accessing your sent folder from outside," I had been documenting everything. Date, time, what I'd supposedly said or done, who was present when it came out. I'd written it in a notebook I kept in the cold room because it was the one place I was certain no one had been through. I had 163 entries. I called Abby at 11 that night. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she'd been waiting. I told her everything. The necklace, the cheque, the gala. She was quiet for a moment. Abby is the kind of person who is very quiet when something is serious. And then she said, "I've been sitting on something for 2 weeks and I didn't know how to bring it up." She told me she'd found a pattern in the studio's sent folder. Emails sent from my account. At times I was documented to be on site at events. 2 of them were sent while she had me on the phone. She'd screenshotted everything and had been waiting for me to be ready to hear it. "Someone has access to your email login," she said. "Lydia was in your office alone at least 3 times in the past year." Then she said the other thing. "You need a family lawyer, Nina, not a mediator. A divorce lawyer today or first thing tomorrow." She gave me a name. Colette Breyer. "She doesn't let people get away with things," Abby said. "That's exactly what my cousin said about her." I called Colette Breyer's office at 9 the next morning. The receptionist said the earliest availability was in 8 days. I said, "My husband threw a check at me in front of 23 witnesses at the Fairmont last night, and I have a notebook with 163 documented incidents going back 8 months, including evidence that someone accessed my business email to manufacture a record of professional errors that never occurred." There was a pause. She put me on hold. She came back and said, "Can you come in at 2 this afternoon?" That morning, before the appointment, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. A Toronto area code, unfamiliar. Something made me answer. "Is this Nina Harland?" A woman's voice. Careful, slightly breathless. "Yes." "My name is Heather Cho. I'm a legal administrator at Alderton and Fitch." A pause. "I know this is coming from nowhere, and I'm sorry. I saw a video someone posted from the Fairmont last night. I recognized the firm name and She stopped. Started again. "I've been sitting on something for 3 weeks, and I can't sit on it anymore." Alderton and Fitch was Curtis's most significant competition on Bay Street. The firm that had been quietly circling a major commercial real estate mandate that Curtis's firm had been positioned to close. A file worth well into 8 figures. Curtis had mentioned it at dinner months ago and said, "When we land this one, we're untouchable." Heather named a coffee shop on King Street. I was there in 40 minutes. She was younger than she'd sounded, maybe 28. She had a travel mug she kept turning in her hands and didn't touch the coffee she'd ordered. She slid an envelope across the table before I'd fully sat down. "I made copies of everything," she said. "If they trace it back to me, I'm done in this industry, and I know it. But I've watched that video 4 times and I keep thinking, that woman didn't do anything. She just asked a question. Inside the envelope was the shape of something I hadn't fully let myself imagine yet. Alderton and Fitch had, 6 weeks ago, signed a retainer with the commercial real estate client Curtis believed he was about to close. The agreement was dated a full month before the gala. Attached to it were visitor logs from Alderton's reception desk. Lydia Harland signed in as a guest of the firm's new senior associate, a man named Derek Chu, who'd transferred from a competing firm 8 months ago, exactly when the incidents at my studio started. She had gone in 4 times, each visit between 40 minutes and 2 hours. Each one logged under business development consultation. "She brought them your husband's client strategy," Heather said quietly. "His confidentiality agreements are among the tightest in the city." Our partners were surprised at how precisely she could describe the other side's offer structure. You don't know the competing firm's exact number unless someone hands it to you. She looked up at me. She wasn't doing this for sport. She was building towards something, a position with the firm, maybe, or a way out of an arrangement that had stopped being useful. I sat with a coffee I had no intention of drinking, and the full shape of it stood up in front of me. Lydia hadn't been gaslighting me for amusement. She needed me discredited and sidelined because I was the one person who moved through Curtis's professional life as a peer, who organized the client dinners, who heard the names dropped over wine, who understood what was being built, and could recognize the sound of it rotting. She needed the picture established. Unreliable Nina, troubled Nina, a wife who causes scenes, before the mandate walked out the door and people started asking how a competitor had known exactly what to offer. The necklace at the gala hadn't been careless. It had been deliberate. She'd worn it, knowing I'd notice, knowing I'd say something, knowing Curtis would react exactly as he did. She needed him to publicly deal with me before the news broke. She needed witnesses. She needed the city councilor and the foundation director and all those junior partners to remember me as the unstable woman, not as the person who'd been quietly watching how everything worked from the inside. I gave everything to Colette Breyer that afternoon. She read through it at her desk, the notebook, Abby's screenshots, Heather's documents, and set it all down and looked at me over her reading glasses. "Mrs. Harland," she said, "this is not a standard file." She asked about Lydia's role at the firm, her access, what she managed. I told her everything: calendar, client contacts, deal documentation, filing systems. Curtis trusted her completely with all of it because she was family, and because she had made herself indispensable in the specific way that people who are planning something always do. Colette tapped her notepad. "She didn't just destabilize you. She used access to your professional accounts to build a documented record of unreliability. A paper trail that would make you look like the problem if you ever tried to speak, while simultaneously removing confidential client information from the firm." She paused. "The divorce will be clean because your documentation is excellent. The other matter extends well beyond a divorce." She looked at me steadily. "From this moment, you don't confront either of them. You gather and you let the relevant parties work. If Curtis suspects what you know, he will move to contain it immediately. Understood?" I nodded. "Good." She slid a legal pad across the desk. "Write down every client name you've ever heard at dinner, every mandate mentioned, everything." I picked up the pen. My hand was steady. It had been steady, I realized, since the moment I'd walked out of the Fairmont. The confrontation came 11 days later, in a boardroom at Colette's firm. Not Curtis's, which was the first detail that mattered. He'd been told it was a preliminary settlement discussion. He came with his own lawyer, a measured man who spent the opening 10 minutes attempting to establish that I'd been emotionally volatile at the gala. Colette let him finish. Then she placed the first document on the table. "The Alderton and Fitch retainer for the Granville commercial mandate," she said. "Signed 6 weeks ago. Dated before your client had indicated to your firm that they were considering alternatives." She placed the second document. "Visitor logs. Alderton and Fitch reception. Lydia Harland. 4 visits across 8 months, logged under business development." I watched Curtis pick up the page. I watched the color change in his face. Not quickly, but completely, the way a stem wilts when the cold room temperature drops below what it can tolerate. "And these," Colette continued, "are screenshots from my client's studio email account. Messages sent from her address at times she was physically on site at events. She could not have sent them. Which means someone with access to her login credentials did." Lydia was seated at the far end of the table. I watched her hands on the surface, very still. Curtis looked at her. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she made the mistake she had always made, which was to underestimate what I was paying attention to. She looked at me instead of at the lawyers, and she let a small smile happen, the same one from the Fairmont, the one that had always meant, "You have nothing." I said, "4 visits, Lydia. You expensed 2 of them to Curtis' firm account. Client development, you wrote in the notes. You put Alderton's parking fees on your brother's company card." The smile disappeared the way confidence always disappears when it realizes the ground underneath was never solid. She started to speak. I heard the word unwell and the word history, and Curtis's lawyer moved to open a folder, and Colette placed one more document on the table without raising her voice. "My firm has been in communication with Alderton and Fitch's general counsel as of yesterday," she said. "They are aware of the source of the confidential information they received. They have retained independent counsel and are separating from the associate who managed these visits." Curtis set down the visitor log. He looked at his sister across the table, and I don't know precisely what moved through him in that moment, but I know what I saw on his face. It was the specific dawning that cannot be walked back. The moment a person understands that the thing they trusted most completely was the thing quietly taking everything apart. "You gave them my client," he said. His voice was controlled in the way voices are controlled when the alternative is worse. Not a question. Lydia said his name. He didn't look away from the pages. "You gave them my client's terms, my file structure, my numbers." She started to reach for something, the old, reliable composure, and it wasn't there anymore. The rest was paperwork. That is how real consequences arrive, not as a single dramatic moment, but as a sequence of certified letters and regulatory notifications, and very quiet phone calls between lawyers at firms you've never heard of. Lydia was terminated for cause, which under Ontario employment law meant no severance, no reference, no stock options that had been quietly accumulating. A complaint was filed with the Law Society of Ontario. She cannot practice as a paralegal while that review proceeds. Alderton and Fitch, facing their own exposure for receiving improperly obtained information, reached a private resolution that unwound a significant portion of the Granville retainer. The client came back to Curtis's firm, but at terms that cost him years of goodwill and millions in renegotiated fees. He got the mandate in the end, just not the version he'd imagined. Under Ontario's family law, what matters in a divorce is the equalization of net family property accumulated during the marriage. Colette was extremely thorough. 7 years of my studio's documented growth. The pattern of emotional manipulation, documented. The public incident at the Fairmont witnessed by 23 people and captured on someone's phone by the time I'd reached the parking garage. Curtis's lawyers were cooperative because the alternative was demonstrably worse. I walked away with the studio, fully mine, no encumbrances. a settlement of $1.8 million, and something I valued more than the money. A legal record, in plain language, stating that the errors attributed to me during the marriage were not errors I made. I never touched the check from the Fairmont. I mailed it back in a plain envelope with no note. I sold the Rosedale house. A house where you've been slowly trained not to trust yourself is not a house that ever fully becomes yours again. I bought a smaller place back in Leslieville, which felt right in a way I didn't need to analyze. Abby is now a full partner at Bloom & Co. Her name is on the lease alongside mine. Heather left Alderton after the internal review and does our administrative accounts now. She deserved somewhere that didn't require her to shred napkins, figuratively speaking. I'm 34 now. I open the studio most mornings before anyone else arrives, and the cold room still smells exactly the way it always has. Wet stems, refrigerated air, the particular quiet of things that are still in the process of becoming. I make coffee at the workbench and spend the first 20 minutes alone with whatever's come in from the market. There are mornings it feels like the best part of the day. People ask me sometimes, friends, the occasional client who's heard pieces of the story, how I didn't see it sooner, the manufactured errors, the emails, all those months. I used to feel something close to shame about that. I don't anymore. Here is what I've come to understand, and I mean this without any performance attached to it. They didn't deceive me because I was fragile. They deceived me because I was loyal. And loyal people assume the people around them are operating by the same rules they are. That was never my flaw. That was my nature. My mistake was staying loyal to people who had already decided I was disposable. The thing they counted on was my willingness to doubt myself. The thing they miscalculated was my notebook in the cold room. Abby had a small sign made for the cold room doorframe, where every person on the team sees it when they come in to start their shift. It reads, "Her memory was fine. They just preferred her uncertain." I read it every morning. Every morning, for the first time in years, I don't need anyone to confirm it's true.